Hello, can everybody hear me at the back okay? Wonderful. Good evening and welcome, and thank you very much for being here. Before I get into the details of tonight's event, I just want to get through a bit of the logistics. And first things is, please turn off your cell phones and no recording. And the reason for that is basically this event is going to go up on social media, so you really don't need to record. The entire event will be up on social media. Last year when I did the event, there was little snippets that were put out on YouTube, and it takes away from the context of the conversation. And given the seriousness of this topic, I think it's really important to watch it in its entirety, so I appreciate your understanding on that. And in the case of a fire alarm, the exit doors are at the front, and we will have to exit through those doors. Sorry, but I gotta go over these logistics. And there is a lot of volunteers around, so if you need any assistance to find out where the washrooms are located or any other question that you may have, the volunteers are more than happy to assist. And hang on to your tickets, so if you do need to leave the building for whatever reason, you will need your ticket to get back in. Thank you. I am so glad to see so many of you out here on a nice summer evening when you could be doing so many other wonderful things, so thank you for that again. Okay. Initially, before I get into the event, we were going to have a Q&A with microphones on both sides, but given the large crowd, what we've decided to do is you could tweet your questions to hashtag C-16, and then at the end, and the panelists that the question is directed to, and then at the end, we will go through the questions and ask the panelists for you. We just don't want to create a huge crowd in the front, and I appreciate your understanding on this. So, my name is Sarina Singh, and I'm the founder and president of the Rights and Freedoms Institute. And this is my second event. Last year, I had the honor of having an event with Dr. Jordan Peterson, Dr. Gad Saad, and Dr. Ornamete. So this is our second event. Now, the purpose and intention of tonight's event is to discuss recent changes to Canadian human rights law and the criminal code that were implemented in 2016. The amendment included gender identity and gender expression into law, as you all know. Tonight's topic is Bill C-16, which is now law, and the politically motivated ideology surrounding these recent changes. The importance of this topic lies in the fact that we are witnessing for the first time in Canada a law that tells us not what words we can't use, but what words we must use. I do not believe that that is acceptable in a democracy. That's my personal opinion, and I don't think we should just accept the government's word on whatever they say, but that's just me, my radical side coming out. We have excellent panelists here tonight, and they're going to discuss this issue in great length, and they're going to discuss it from many different angles, including the application of this law, its interpretation, journalistic freedom, sex differences in the biological perspective, and trans activism on university campuses, and how this law was in fact used to reprimand one of our guests, speakers. Sadly, the issue of free speech and compelled speech is now not just exclusive to Canada. We are seeing a pattern now in the Western world where our most cherished value of free speech is under constant assault. The arguments put forward by those who state that these laws are necessary because it's inclusive, it's based on human rights, equality, compassion, and inclusion, we are going to unpack that and discuss that and a lot more. Like many of you, this issue became important to me and very real when Dr. Jordan Peterson made his infamous videos critiquing the government on compelled speech and reminding us the important lessons of history when we go down this path, what could and does indeed happen. The issue is complex for many, I understand that, but I defer to the great Ben Shapiro, who said, facts don't care about feelings. Before I introduce the panelists, I just want to say a couple of things about me, since people ask why I do this and what's the motivation and why am I so content on getting all the nasty hate mail that I do get. So I guess part of that explanation is in my previous life, I was part of the problem. I was complicit in suppressing free speech. I was a radical social justice warrior. I was a regressive leftist. I was a radical feminist. And thank God I evolved. And I involved because I saw the absolute damage this was doing to children, teens, and families. How the regressive left was hell-bent on suppressing free speech, ideology, and feelings were more important than logic, reason, and the law. Descartes' maxim, I think, therefore I am, was replaced by I feel, therefore I am. A culture of narcissism that now values individual feeling over science and logic troubles me. My hope for tonight is not that you will just enjoy the conversation for 2 hours and then leave, but that you will leave here with a renewed sense of optimism and recognize the importance of having our voices heard. Because I think what this legislation tells us is that when we don't speak out, the government will make your decisions for you. And I'm ending soon, but I want to thank the parents that have contacted me. And I've been very moved by their plight, their despair and agony at the lack of supports available to them when their children come out as a gender fluid, non-binary, or the opposite gender. They rightly feel the medical establishment and the school system is against them. Let me tell you, these fears are warranted. I am a former counselor with Catholic Children's Aid, and I was there for 8 years. And I can assure you that if you do not adhere to the rules set out by the ideologues, you will face consequences. So these fears are very, very justified. We may not like scientific data and what it reveals to us, but it doesn't give society the permission to eliminate sections we don't like. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker to the stage, Jared Brown. Jared is a trial lawyer from Toronto, litigating commercial disputes and employment matters. In May of 2017, Jared joined Dr. Jordan B. Peterson and testified before the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee on Bill C-16. These videos have been viewed over 1 million times. Jared most recently spoke at length about authoritarian initiatives emanating from the Law Society in a series of YouTube video discussions with Dr. Jordan Peterson and Bruce Pardee of Queen's Law University. Jared's commentary on legal issues can be found online, including blog posts, YouTube videos, and through his Twitter handle @LitigationGuy. And just on a personal note, Jared was the first person I approached to about this event. And even though he has an extremely busy practice and family commitments, he was so generous and gracious to commit to being here tonight to talk to all of you. So thank you, Jared. I'm very grateful for that. Jared Brown.
Thanks, Sarina. It's great to see so many people here. I see a lot of free thinkers, truth seekers, and I did see a few deplorables as well. So let's get into it. What's going on right now? I mean, we're all feeling it, we're all seeing it. There's been a breakdown and an almost complete elimination of our political discourse. The talking is stopping. Well, the way I see it, there's actions and reactions. Tonight, we're talking about one action in particular, gender ideology, gender legislation. What are the reactions? Well, you're seeing that as well. If you're on social media, you see these conversations being had. You see it on YouTube. You see it in long-form podcasts. You see it in the rise of the intellectual dark web. But you also see it in events just like this. So why am I here? It's something I've been asking myself quite a bit over the last few years. In fact, I was asking this question at about this very time last year. Just looking at the faces, you need to know that I'm sitting there. All my years before the Superior Court of Justice, the Court of Appeal, and the tribunals of the land did not prepare me for the insanity of a Canadian Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Subcommittee. It's also dawning on both of us at this moment that our small L liberal democratic institutions aren't so liberal anymore. If you haven't watched the video, I encourage you to check it out. The comments section is particularly enlightening, as you'll see what our friends from around the world think of our Canadian Senate. As Sarina has mentioned to you, I'm a trial lawyer. I litigate primarily commercial disputes and employment matters. I represent companies and individuals in disputes and risk management issues. But over the last few years, the employment side of the practice has become dominated by human rights tribunal complaints. The Human Rights Tribunal. In Ontario, it's also known as one of the social justice tribunals of Ontario. And that's where the fun is these days. There was the time I defended a company that had been dragged to the tribunal. Apparently, one of its employees had dared to wish Merry Christmas to a fellow employee on Christmas Eve. It turns out that the employee on the receiving end of those season's greetings happened to be Muslim. A complaint of harassment and discrimination quickly followed the holiday cheer. There was the time I was representing a small business owner at the tribunal. Before coming to Canada, this woman had fled communists in Laos in the middle of the night while being shot at. I had the very unique and interesting experience of watching an Ontario tribunal member try to tell this woman how she didn't understand human rights, that she ought to take a course in how we do human rights in Ontario. It's stories like that that had me looking very closely at our human rights regime. And it's right about that time when C-16 came forward. Tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and roll through how C-16 gets us to compelled speech. I'm going to talk about why compelled speech is dangerous, what the courts have said. I've read far too many half-baked opinion pieces that say, no, that's not what's going on here. While going through the compelled speech aspects, I'm going to touch on some of the craziness that was going on behind the scenes during the passage of the bill. And then I'm going to get into what's going on right now since the passage. Prior to C-16, transgendered individuals enjoyed wide-ranging human rights protection in Canada for a very, very long time. Transgendered individuals had protection against discrimination under the grounds of sex in all the various human rights codes. So you have to ask yourself then, why was C-16 and its provincial equivalents introduced? Well, you see, C-16 was the imposition of a social constructionist theory on gender into the law. C-16 and its provincial counterparts disconnect gender from biological sex in our legal system. It results in the recognition of non-male or female genders. Now, what you have up in front of you is a summary of the enactment. This enactment amends the Canadian Human Rights Act to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination. It's pretty benign. What you won't find in there is a definition as to what those bolded terms mean. In fact, up until December of 2016, the only definition for these terms could be found on a little-known Department of Justice website. I appreciate it's hard to make out, but what the slide says is, will gender identity and gender expression be defined in the bill? In order to ensure that the law would be as inclusive as possible, the terms gender identity and gender expression are not defined in the bill. With very few exceptions, grounds of discrimination are not defined in legislation, but are left to the courts, tribunals, and commissions to interpret and explain, based on their detailed experience with particular cases. It then goes on and says definitions of these terms have already been given by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, for example. The Commission has provided helpful discussion and examples that can offer good practical guidance. The Canadian Human Rights Commission will provide similar guidance on the meanings of these terms. So we're told we have to look to the Ontario Human Rights Commission for these definitions. Oh yeah, and that Department of Justice website with the connection to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, it was suddenly pulled down in December 2016 when critics like Dr. Peterson began to connect the dots. This is well before the bill actually passed the Senate, which caused one senior Conservative senator to say he'd never seen that happen before. So we roll over to the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies to see what these words mean. The code does not define the grounds of gender identity, gender expression, or sex. Instead, the understanding of these and other related terms and the implications for the code and Ontario Human Rights Commission policies is evolving. from tribunal and court decisions, social science, research, as well as self-identity and common everyday use. Gender identity is each person's internal and individual experience of gender. It is a person's sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. A person's gender identity may be the same as or different from their birth-assigned sex. This is where you get the instantiation of the social constructionist theory on gender into the law. You see, these policies that we're looking at, they are the law. The tribunal has to follow this when it interprets the law. Now, in addition to writing the law, the Ontario Human Rights Commission can also investigate and prosecute complaints. They can also deploy warrantless searches in that regard. Well, what else do their policies say? This is the policy that gives rise to the mandatory use of pronouns. Gender-based harassment can involve refusing to refer to a person by their self-identified name and proper personal pronoun. Now, here's some more craziness that happened during the passage of this bill. Some of you may recall that Dr. Peterson began to question this piece of legislation in September of 2016. He correctly identified the social constructionist theory and the mandatory pronouns. He actually engaged in a debate hosted by U of T on November 19th of 2016. He was debating, among other people, a person by the name of Brenda Kosman. Ms. Kosman was a driving force behind this piece of legislation. What's most interesting about that debate, and once again, it's another thing you might want to go seek out on YouTube, but Ms. Kosman showed up at the debate and in opening her submission said, well, everyone, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has actually clarified its policy on pronouns. And that's right, they did it the day before the debate. And only Ms. Kosman knew about it. And she told everyone at the debate what the new clarification was. This clarification is it a violation of the code to not address people by their choice of pronoun? Refusing to refer to a trans person by their chosen name and a personal pronoun that matches their gender identity or purposely misgendering will likely be discrimination when it takes place in a social area covered by the code, including employment, housing, and services like education. The law is otherwise unsettled as to whether someone can insist on any single or one gender-neutral pronoun in particular. You see, when offered the opportunity, the Commission doubled down. When Dr. Peterson said that the law compelled the use of gender-neutral pronouns, his critics said that he was crazy. He had the law wrong. But then the Commission comes out the day before his big debate with one of the proponents of the law and says, yeah, it's about pronouns. It's a fascinating dialogue between a critic of the law and the unelected body that was making up the law on pronouns in real time. Now, whether you are of the opinion that gender is a social construct, we all must use the nomenclature when we engage on that subject. You won't find any other protection like it in the code. There's no other group that can dictate the words or opinions that we must mouth. Now, why is all of this a problem? What you're looking at is an excerpt from the Supreme Court of Canada case, National Bank of Canada and Retail Clerks, 1984. The Supreme Court of Canada has said that compelled speech is totalitarian. Justice Beats, this type of penalty is totalitarian and as such alien to the tradition of free nations like Canada, even for the repression of the most serious crimes. Going further and speaking about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Justice Beats says, these freedoms guarantee to every person the right to express opinions he may have, a fortiori, that's some fancy legal work. They must prohibit compelling anyone to utter opinions that are not his own. If you have some vacation time coming up and you have a hankering to look up case law on compelled speech, I encourage you to take a look around. Spoiler alert, you're not going to find any. The reason forcing people to mouth words and opinions is totalitarian. Governments don't typically put an affinity for totalitarianism on their campaign literature. Now, proponents of the legislation, including our Minister of Justice, says no, the law does not compel speech. And I guess to the extent that you agree with a social constructionist theory on gender, I suppose she's absolutely right. But for those in the scientific community that might disagree, I think those words and opinions are going to pose some difficulty. Some more fun that happened behind the scenes in this piece of legislation. Being pragmatic people, those of us who testified that C-16 was an unprecedented compelling of speech, proposed an amendment to the bill. If the supporters of C-16 were serious in their assertion that the legislation would not compel speech, then let's just make that clear on the face of the bill. So we proposed an amendment. For greater certainty, nothing in this act requires the use of a particular word or expression that corresponds to the gender identity or expression of any person. Remember, the Minister of Justice says, we're not here to compel speech. Well, the amendment was unanimously rejected by the Liberal senators. You see, the intention of the bill was to compel speech all along. The supporters of the bill intend to control the linguistic territory. They want to force you to use their words and opinions. So what's going on now with the passage of the bill? At this point in the life cycle of C-16 and the provincial laws that are like it, nobody's actually taken the compelled speech component head on. But rest assured, the tribunals are dealing with an abundance of new claims of discrimination and harassment based on gender identity and gender expression. Recently, an individual identified their gender as the king. They brought a claim to the Ontario Tribunal alleging that they were discriminated against that their monarchy and their authority were discriminated against. In another, a man who was required to shave his beard because of workplace policy brought a claim alleging discrimination on the basis of gender expression. Another individual, identifying as a transgender female, I have to read this actually, a transgender female lesbian feminist, brought a claim alleging that decorative gift cards for sale at Walmart for men only and manly products were discriminatory. Now, these claims were all dismissed, but not before the expenditure of significant time, resources, and money by the tribunal, and particularly the respondents that were named in them. So what happens if someone decides to question the ideology and the nomenclature in laws like C-16? I'm going to encourage you to look up the case of Barry Neufeld. Barry's a BC school board trustee who is now defending himself before the BC Human Rights Tribunal. Mr. Neufeld stated his belief that parts of the curriculum in BC that teach that gender is fluid and untethered from biological sex are unscientific theories. I'd also recommend that you look up the case of Dr. David Makareth in the UK. After 26 years as a doctor and medical assessor, Dr. Makareth was fired for saying that gender is biologically and genetically determined and not a social construct. Some of you may know about the vice president of the BC NDP party, who has openly said that anyone that states that a transgender woman is not a woman is guilty of hate speech and has stated an intention to prosecute them as such. Finally, you may have heard of a certain teaching assistant at Laurier University. Since the passage of C-16, this same authoritarianism and compelled speech is being pushed elsewhere. The Liberal government's summer jobs program currently requires that everyone adhere to the government's pro-abortion position in order to receive funding. The Law Society of Ontario, my very own regulator, is now rolling out an ideological purity test across Ontario. All lawyers are now required to declare a statement of principles, agreeing to adhere to the latest progressive left platitudes of equity and diversity. We may agree that some of these things sound like absurdities, but make no mistake, these are fundamentally illiberal laws originating from increasingly illiberal institutions. It's imperative that we all speak up, we speak our truth, and we call out authoritarianism wherever it manifests. Thanks.
Thank you, Jared. Before I introduce our next guest, for those of you who've been asking where my webpage is and my Facebook information advertising this event, the answer to that is I've been blocked with a message that keeps popping up that it does not meet community standards for me to hold this event, to have this conversation. And that the fact this is happening in Canada is very alarming to me. Our next guest, Dr. Debra So, holds a PhD in sexual neuroscience research from York University. She writes a weekly column for Playboy.com and a monthly column for the Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper. Her writing has also appeared in Harper's, The Wall Street Journal, The Los Angeles Times, Scientific American, Colette, and many others. She has received international media coverage in outlets including the New York Times, NPR, The Washington Post, the BBC, National Review, and USA Today. Her Twitter handle is @Dr. Debra So. Please welcome Dr. So to the stage. Thank you.
Okay. So I spent 11 years in academia as a sex researcher, and I still have absolutely no idea why anyone thinks there are 71 different genders. Let me get one thing out of the way. Gender is binary, and it is not a social construct. That should really be the end of my talk today. But as I'm sure you know, by virtue of being here, we are drowning in misinformation on this subject. Biological sex is either male or female, based on our reproductive functions. Gender, on the other hand, is how we feel, whether we feel masculine or feminine in relation to our biological sex. When sperm fertilizes an egg at conception, the baby will be either female or male, and biology will dictate hormonal exposure in utero and the child's resulting gender identity as well. For over 99% of us, our biological sex is our gender identity. So if we want to talk about things from a scientific perspective, there are only two sexes, and there are only two genders. To suggest otherwise is not scientifically accurate. I first started writing about the issue of gender because mainstream media's coverage of it frankly terrifies me. From my time in academia, I can tell you there's a long list of areas of research that are forbidden, and this is affecting what the public is and isn't allowed to know. Bill C-16 has contributed to this climate by writing false and unscientific ideas about gender into federal law. Nowadays, self-determination is everything, and some people will stop at nothing to push this agenda. They will torture logic and tokenize certain groups in order to gain political ground, like pointing to people with a difference of sex development, which is a medical condition previously known as intersex, as proof that gender is a spectrum. But this isn't accurate because people with a difference of sex development, who make up roughly 1% of the population, possess anatomy characteristic of both sexes. For example, a child may be born with a vulva as well as testicular tissue. This is due to differences in genetics and hormonal exposure in the womb. So even in these cases, biology is still dictating someone's sense of gender. There are thousands of studies showing the effects of prenatal testosterone on the developing brain. Even before birth, exposure to testosterone changes the way in which male and female brains grow. There's no way that behavioral differences we see between men and women are purely due to socialization, unless someone wants to argue that the unborn child is capable of learning gendered stereotypes while they are still in the womb. The bottom line is, environment plays a role in shaping us, but it can't override biology. People supporting the idea that gender is a social construct will often say that science backs up their views. And the next time you encounter someone like this, I suggest you ask them, what science are they referring to? If they're able to come up with anything, they'll probably point to a study that came out a few years ago claiming that male and female brains exist along a mosaic and aren't actually any different from one another. But a group of my colleagues reanalyzed the exact same brain data from that study and found that you could, in fact, tell a male brain from a female brain at a rate much higher than chance. What's disappointing is that the media promoted the first study to no end because its findings were flashy and politically correct. But they refused to cover the second study because apparently being scientifically accurate isn't as lucrative. It isn't sexist to talk about sex differences. What's sexist is assuming that women need to be identical to men in order to be worthy of equal treatment. Defending biology nowadays gets you called not only alt-right and misogynistic, but a transphobic bigot too. And so this brings me to the hate speech part of my talk. People can identify however they like, but none of these identity labels are based in any science at all. That goes for being gender non-binary, gender neutral, agender, bigender, pangender, gender fluid, gender free, or moon gender, just to name a few. Just wait. All of these labels mean that you identify, to some extent, as either both genders or neither. Moon gender, I've learned, means your gender only comes out at night. And I'm not making it up, I swear. The reality is, no one is 100% male or female typical. Think of the average guy. He's probably into a bunch of things that guys like, but he probably has some female typical traits too, and there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe he likes watching sports, but he also likes talking on the phone. And before... I see that you guys are laughing, but if anyone gets upset when this is on the internet, these are gender traits commonly used in the field of social psychology, so you can't call me a sexist for using them as examples. In my case, I'm a woman who loves watching mixed martial arts, which is a sport that has mostly male fans. So I spend a lot of time asking myself, am I really both genders, or gender neutral, or neither? Or does it just mean that I'm a woman that likes watching a male-dominated sport? No one espousing this gender nonsense seems to have really thought it through, though, because from a practical standpoint, to say that you are both genders or neither still depends, by definition, on the concept of gender being binary. Some people might say, okay, so it's just kids on Tumblr having fun. Why, Debra, do you have to go and rain on their parade? Well, I say it has implications for the rest of us. When we look at the education system, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario teaches children that gender is not binary. As I wrote in the Globe and Mail on Monday, Ontario's most recent sex ed curriculum taught children that gender is a social construct, the result of traditional gender norms, and that some people are both genders or don't have one. The other day, someone sent me guidelines from a school board a few hours from here. Their sex ed curriculum teaches kids about puberty, as it should, but it refers to children as people with a penis and people with a vagina, instead of simply calling them boys and girls. As I mentioned earlier, for 99% of us, our biological sex is our gender. Less than 1% of the adult population identifies as transgender, a number that has doubled in the last 10 years. So to rewrite children's education as though it's commonplace for a person to identify as the opposite sex is inaccurate, potentially confusing to them, and irresponsible. Planned Parenthood in Ottawa recently tweeted that anatomy isn't male or female, it just is. And that it's transphobic to believe otherwise. They also warned that the adults in the room may not get it, and it's a child's job to re-educate them. Pediatricians will also have an interesting perspective going forward. The Canadian Pediatric Society released a guideline a few months ago that was meant to help doctors and parents understand the concept of gender. Among its recommendations, doctors were told that gender is a spectrum, that gender identity and gender expression are unrelated, and a child's sex is assigned at birth. And finally, while attending a research talk at a university a few months ago, one of the presenters actually showed slides of both the gender-bred person and the gender unicorn. For those of you who may have been fortunate enough to not be exposed to either of these atrocities, there are cartoons that were made for the purpose of teaching children that there are more genders than male and female, that gender identity has nothing to do with gender expression, anatomy, or sexual orientation. So where does that leave us? More and more people don't know what the truth is. The fact that these gender fantasies are being taught as part of the education curriculum means that young children are growing up with a distorted worldview. I find it really unsettling that many parents who know better seem to be okay with this because they'd rather be seen as progressive than dare to rock the boat. Another side effect is that clinicians who work with children aren't able to do their job. We only have to look at the rapidly multiplying number of young children who are identifying as transgender to see the social contagion aspect of this way of thinking. Many of these kids have some other medical condition that is leading them to feel the way that they do, whether it's autism, borderline personality disorder, or trauma. But because of the current political climate, along with laws like Bill 77 that incorrectly conflate any kind of questioning of gender identity with conversion therapy, therapists and doctors are too afraid to push back because they could lose their livelihood for doing so. I've written previously about my experience growing up as a straight woman in the gay community, and what I find most disturbing is that with this movement, gay children are being encouraged to transition so that they appear heterosexual. If you take the example of a little boy who is feminine, who tells his parents that he's a girl, when he grows up, he's likely going to be a gay man. If you take that same little boy and allow him to transition to female, when he grows up, he's going to look like he's a straight woman. Let me be clear, I believe that transgender adults, people with a difference of sex development, and those who are gender non-conforming deserve dignity, respect, and equal rights. I believe that gender dysphoria is a real phenomenon, and those who are suffering should be free to live their lives as they choose, including pursuing a social and medical transition in adulthood if they decide to. My issue is that the way we talk about biology and gender should not be maligned in order to facilitate these rights. Children should not be used as pawns to further this agenda. Scientists should be able to do their work without interference. They shouldn't have to waste their time debating facts as obvious as how many genders there are. What I find most frustrating about Bill C-16 is it doesn't even achieve what it presumably set out to do, which is increase societal acceptance for people who don't fit our expectations around gender norms. The ideology promoted by Bill C-16 only fosters resentment, shuts down meaningful discussion, and impairs our ability to understand what it means to be human. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. So. It's a strange thing that what is so blatantly obvious and scientific nowadays is being questioned and challenged. Our next panelist, Barbara Kay, is a respected journalist. She graduated from the University of Toronto in Honours English and furthered her studies at McGill University's Graduate School and received her MA in English Literature in 1966. Her passion for literature landed her in a job at Concordia University in Montreal. Barbara's journalism career began in the 90s, and since 2003, Barbara has been a weekly columnist for the National Post, writing on a variety of different issues and topics, from freedom of speech to cultural misandry, Islamist reverberations in Western culture, and the bizarre world of canine politics. Barbara's writing has appeared in multiple publications, including the New York Daily News, Campus Watch 9, Dorchester Review, among many other. She's also been a contributor to many local and national radio talk shows. Barbara, also with Irina Pop, published a memoir. The theme was honor-motivated violence. Barbara has been recognized for excellence in journalism and received the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship Award, and in 2013, the Diamond Jubilee Medal for Excellence in Journalism. She's also been recognized by the National Coalition of Men's 2019 Award for Fairness in Journalism. Before I call Barbara to the stage, I'd like to thank her personally for writing an article about me and my family and our struggles in Toronto, in the East End of Toronto, and what led me to my path of social and political activism. I've only known Barbara for a short period of time, but it really feels like I've known her forever. Please, everybody, welcome Barbara Kay to the stage.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes? Thank you for that very warm welcome, and congratulations, Sarina, on putting together this terrific event, and with all these people. It's very good to see such a wonderful turnout. Sarina's worked very hard for this. The philosopher Voltaire famously observed, "To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize." In Voltaire's day, it was dangerous to criticize the Catholic Church and its dogmas. In our era, it is dangerous to criticize the Church of gender identity and its dogmas. Gender fluidity is a very church-like dogma in that it is based entirely on faith. When you consider the other grounds for discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act, race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, genetic characteristics, and so forth, you'll see that every other ground for discrimination is certifiable with objective evidence. Only gender identity is based entirely in subjective feeling. Bill C-16 compels us to act as though the notion that sex and gender are entirely separate phenomena were settled science rather than what Dr. Debra has just explained that it is, a recently conceived theory unsupported by databases sufficiently large for true scientific evaluation. Classic liberalism concerned itself with the dignity of the individual. Progressivism is concerned with people's feelings. Dignity, a human estate whose criteria reflect extensive philosophical and legal precedents, cutting across all race, class, and gender lines, is a rational basis for a rights discussion. Judgments based on feelings rely completely on the good faith and rational interpretive powers of the complainant. Much of the Me Too movement is based entirely in feelings of what is or is not appropriate speech, tone, gesture, or intention. The statement, "I felt uncomfortable," spoken by a woman, holds great social power, sometimes leading to failures of due process that ruin innocent people's lives. In elevating feelings as the arbiter of a human right, Bill C-16 privileges individual comfort over individual rights, which makes it not only a bad law, but a dangerous law. In an illuminating 2011 academic paper, John F. Furedy, now deceased, then a retired professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, likened institutions and governments that privilege individual comfort over individual rights to totalitarian regimes. He wrote, "The most striking feature of totalitarian societies is that the comfort criterion takes precedent over considerations of truth in general and fairness to individuals in particular. Furedy coined a phrase for this tendency, velvet totalitarianism. He describes 5 common elements that apply to any form of totalitarianism, hard or soft. 1, the presence of uninterpretable laws. There is no objective metric for defining the alleged offense. 2, the presence and power of unqualified pseudo-experts like commissars in the Soviet Union and equity officers in universities, often who have no academic accreditation or even a higher education degree, and yet who pontificate on matters such as the nature of the curriculum or what faculty should be hired. 3rd, status-defined ethics. In a totalitarian society, imprisonment or torture is permitted if the victim is a crypto-capitalist or a Zionist conspirator. In a velvet totalitarian state, white heterosexuals or Christians are permissible targets for accusations of racism or transphobia. Furedy would have appreciated the phrase, white girl tears, a locution of contempt applied to Lindsay Shepherd. 4th is a fear of engaging in public discussion of controversial but fundamental issues, on which I will elaborate. And finally, 5th, a demonization of those perceived as political or ideological dissidents. Most journalists are liberals and respect the official dogmas of the Church of Gender Identity. Even journalists known for their objectivity tend to treat the Church's high priests with kid gloves. It's not always glaringly obvious, but it's there. In the segment of TVO's The Agenda on trans pronoun usage, made famous via the Lindsay Shepherd affair, for example, the focus has been on Jordan Peterson's resistance to invented words. But I was equally struck by panelist Nicholas Matt, a transgender academic, claiming that studies had proved that sex and gender were completely unlinked. At this whopper of an untruth, host Steve Paikin did not raise a challenging or even a curious eyebrow. Paikin should have politely asked, "Really? Can you be specific?" He pulled his punches because transphobia. For another example, in December 2017, the CBC made the decision to pull a scheduled BBC documentary, Trans Kids, Who Knows Best, from its lineup after complaints came in that it spread misinformation. It wasn't misinformation the protesters objected to, it was information. This was not a documentary made by a few Ryerson journalism students for course credits. It was made by the freaking BBC, presumably the ne plus ultra of reliable, credible, and even politically correct journalism. If the BBC cannot be trusted on this issue, who can? So, effectively, the CBC conceded that it is ruled, on this subject anyway, by special interest activists. Now, unlike indigenous correctness, with its unified narrative of uninterrupted victimhood, LGBT has become increasingly divided internally, and this can be confusing for media people. The turf wars, kind of a pun because TURF and TERF, between feminists and trans activists is fierce, hate-filled, and sometimes even physically violent. The liberal media want to be trans-friendly, but they also want to be feminist-friendly. That's a tough call sometimes when radical feminists are accusing male-to-female trans activists of being misogynists in drag and battling for ownership of the word woman. I would not normally side with radical feminists, but on this issue, I have a few readers here. But on this issue, they are in the right. If a woman is defined as anyone who identifies as a woman, then trans women have the right to be rape counselors, an intolerable intrusion into what should be a safe space for rape survivors. In Alice Through the Looking Glass, Lewis Carroll was prescient on the trans movement's co-optation of words and their definition. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That's all. So pronouns were never the real issue. There are Humpty Dumptys in every movement, and of movements, there is no end. I developed a pretty thick skin early in my journalism career dealing with the pit bull advocacy movement, whose zealotry, they often equate pit bulls literally with Anne Frank, equals and often surpasses that of social justice, race, and gender warriors. Researching and writing about canine politics also taught me that data, statistics, epidemiology, and peer-reviewed research do not interest many journalists half so much as mantras, myths, bogus studies, and downloaded narratives, a fact that is evident every time, for example, Jordan Peterson is interviewed by a feminist media host. Canadian journalists have more to fear from offended Indigenous activists than from offended trans activists. Where the church of gender identity is built on the shifting sand of unsustainable theories and will likely, hopefully, collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, the church of colonial oppression is built on the solid rock of actual history and national guilt. I have written several critical columns on trans activists' unseemly aggression, but so far, the only punishment I have suffered is vilification on Twitter and one lawyer's letter to the postmillennial.com, where I also have a weekly column, meant to intimidate, but without teeth and ignored. On the other hand, I was fired from a fun gig with CBC Radio, a regular spot on their news trivia comedy show, Because News, for indigenously incorrect remarks I had made on another network. I wasn't told which one it was. It might have been my statement that the residential schools were based in good intentions. But don't pity me for being fired, because being fired from a CBC radio show is only a disappointment. Well, it is a disappointment, but only. Unlike young journalists with their livelihood and career goals in the balance, my mortgage is paid and all my ambitions have been fulfilled. Following the famous Cultural Appropriation Prize debacle, posited in the spirit of satire by Hal Niedzwiecki, editor of Right magazine, many journalists paid a stiff price for joining in what they perceived was a parodic concept. Some, including Niedzwiecki, were fired or felt forced to resign, as my son Jonathan Kay did from the Walrus magazine. Steve Latorante, managing editor of CBC's The National, was reassigned rather than fired, but as part of his punishment had to sit within a circle of his co-workers in perfect Maoist re-education style and apologize to each one in turn. I am told some of the women cried. All this for the crime of attempting to apply humor to politically correct absurdities. There is an Arabic word, ketman, the position taken by those who desire to be, quote, at one with others in order not to be alone. The word arises in a 1953 book, a series of essays by the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz called The Captive Mind, about what happens to the inner lives of intellectuals living under totalitarianism. When Stalin's Iron Curtain fell over Poland after World War II, intellectuals had to adapt very quickly. They were called upon not only to obey the regime, but to proselytize on its behalf. Because it was too painful to imagine they were parroting lies, Miłosz's fellow Polish intellectuals insisted they were speaking words they believed. They were not lying. Ketman goes deeper than lying. It is a kind of performance engaged in to survive the sensation of living with a divided mind. Those practicing Ketman are actors. Everything they say is part of a performance. You can feel the performative effect of most spoken and written commentary every time you turn to a progressively disposed newspaper, website, or TV show. Privately, many media people complain about having to defend what they know to be objectively indefensible. But to maintain their status as woke and enlightened, according to criteria set by ideologues and monitored by Twitter mobs, they will say things they do not believe, but have convinced themselves are necessary to say to advance that laudable goal, social justice, always on the horizon, never arising, because its utopian goalposts never stop receding. There is an old Jewish joke that applies here. In the era of the Russian pogroms, two Jews are walking home from synagogue when they are accosted by hooligans. They flee, the hooligans in pursuit. As they run, one Jew says to the other, "Why are we running? There are only two of them, and there are two of us." His friend replies, "Yes, but they are together, and we are alone." To be alone in an age of ideological tyranny is not a question of numbers. It is a question of who has the power, who is together, and who is impotent or near impotent to fight back. This event, as Sarina said, was scheduled to take place at a downtown YMCA. One activist's opposition was enough for us to be deplatformed. One, and I've been there before. Cancellation of events with this and similarly politically incorrect topics occur routinely all over the country. We are lucky to be here, but we should not have had to be lucky. In the US, 62% of students who identify as left-leaning agree that silencing speech through protest is acceptable. And 1 in 5 college students believe it is acceptable to use violence to stop speech with which they disagree. These are chilling numbers that demonstrate the uphill battle we are fighting. But even though we are alone and they are together, we must not flee. Unlike the Jews in Russia, it is not our lives that are at stake, only our self-respect. As the brilliant journalist Charles Krauthammer, who died just weeks ago, once said, "You're betraying your whole life if you don't say what you think and you don't say it honestly and bluntly." Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm reminded of something my mentor, Dr. Jordan Peterson, always says: the price you pay when you don't speak up is worse than the price you pay when you speak up. And our next speaker is a lady who did just that. She spoke up. She is someone who truly does not need an introduction, but for the 1 or 2 of you in this room who don't know who she is, here it is. Lindsay Shepherd is a graduate student at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. She's working on her MA in Cultural Analysis and Social Theory. Her research focuses on Canadian campus culture and freedom of expression in universities. She's a BA Honours in Communication and Political Science from Simon Fraser University. She is the president and co-founder of the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry, a collective of students, professors, and community members who seek to promote a culture of free speech and viewpoint diversity. She has appeared on the Rubin Report, Louder with Crowder, and the Mark Steyn Show, and has been published in Maclean's, National Post, and the Daily Caller. You can find her on Twitter at New World Hominin. It is my pleasure to introduce to you a fearless free speech warrior, Lindsay Shepherd.
All right, so as Sarina was saying, I think she so kindly invited me to speak today because I'm the first person where it's public knowledge that I was accused of violating Bill C-16. And in case you're not familiar with that situation, I was a TA back in November for a class in communication studies, and I showed a video containing Jordan Peterson, and it was actually his criticism of Bill C-16. And, I was neutral in regards to this video, and I presented his criticisms as valid. But that was enough to be hauled into a meeting with a diversity official and 2 professors. And I was actually in that meeting, if you've listened to the whole recording that I leaked, they accused me of violating Bill C-16, which is kind of interesting because presenting a criticism of the bill as legitimate, you're actually violating the bill. But it was quickly debunked that this didn't apply to the university classroom, Bill C-16, because it's federal jurisdiction. But in an article that was kind of talking about that in the National Post that came out in November, a lawyer did say that presenting Peterson's argument neutrally could violate the Ontario Human Rights Code. So it could be a provincial problem, but it would be a stretch. But I don't want to go on and on about that one incident for too long, because I find it pertinent to comment on the cultural trends that I see happening in this country that play into the mentality of the diversity official and the professors that interrogated me. At UBC, there is currently a design project underway, and it's an LGBTQ and trans installation, and it's going to be on campus. And they're going to paint the pillars of a building and possibly the staircase. It's a design competition, so like one of these designs will win. And it's going to be painted with two flags, the colors of two flags. So one is the gay pride flag, which is the rainbow one we're probably all familiar with. And then the other one is the trans pride flag, which is striped with white, baby pink, and baby blue. And so imagine just kind of the stripes on the stairs or something like that outside of the student union building. And they have quite a few kinks they need to figure out with this project, because they're still debating whether they need to add like a brown and black stripe to the trans flag to represent Indigenous and people of color. Some people are upset that it's called the LGBTQ trans installation because they took the T out of LGBTQ. They would rather it be called the LGBTQ2SIA+. Or something like that installation. So yeah, they have some kinks to figure out. So this installation is being done to promote, a positive environment, show the students that it's an inclusive and welcoming environment on campus. But I was thinking about these claims that they made, because when I look at the trans flag, I'm fine with the gay pride one generally, but the trans flag, it invokes in me people who are intolerant of diversity of thought, people who have maliciously campaigned against me at my own university, people who are currently using the internal complaints process to try to jeopardize my degree, people who try to get people they don't agree with fired or deplatformed. So you were talking about that CBC documentary. That was Twitter trans activism that got that off. And I believe they're after you also, Barbara, for appearing on CBC and criticizing the, the sex ed curriculum? Yeah, and all you said was maybe gender ideology shouldn't be in there. And, all of a sudden, the prominent trans activists are saying, Barbara should never be let back on CBC ever, right? So, right. Another disappointment, maybe? So they try to get people they don't agree with fired or deplatformed. Unfortunately, I sometimes think of people who are smug and self-obsessed, and I think of people who are power-hungry. And so when I see that trans flag, and let's be clear, I'm talking about the militant trans activists that fly that flag. I'm not talking about people who want to live their lives. It's not welcoming or inclusive to me. It doesn't represent that at all. It does not represent a positive environment. And so what's kind of interesting is 2 years ago, also on the UBC campus, someone burned the gay pride flag. So it was Pride Month. Someone took it down, and they burned it, left the remnants on campus, and this was at first being investigated as a hate crime. But it was soon found out that the person who burned the flag was a 31-year-old transsexual UBC student, and they burned it because her name was Brooklyn Fink, and she was upset with what she called loud and proud trans activism. She said that 10 or 12 years ago, she could walk down the street and people would just look at her and think, oh, this is just an extremely tall man. Or sorry, woman. This is an extremely tall woman. But now, with all the loud and proud trans activism, people look at her and think, oh, like this might actually be a guy. And so she's kind of upset with the loud and proudness of the trans movement, and that was a statement that she wanted to make. And she said that the UBC flag flying is enough because that represents the whole student body, not just a minority of the students. And I don't think this can be justified to make people hide their identity. That's kind of the trouble with it, is, people can be as loud and proud about their identity as they want, really, that's their right. But I think it does show that there is resistance within the movements, right? And this was an act of resistance. But aside from these small acts, there is a wider mainstream cultural shift occurring, specifically in terms of normalizing the declaration of pronouns. So I get messages sometimes from students, just at various universities in Canada. And one thing that I've heard a bit recently is their TAs, so people who were, in the job that I used to have, in their first class, they would have to go around and say their pronouns when they're introducing themselves. And actually, I know a TA in my department who did the same thing. She obviously didn't like me. And so I give the advice to these students. I say, well, when it comes to be your turn, just say your name. Don't do the pronoun thing. But if the TA then forces you to do it, just, politely decline. Don't laugh or smirk or mock them or anything. Just, politely say, sorry, no thank you, right? I think that's fair. But it's relatively low stakes in the classroom because there's not a lot of consequence if you do something like that. But, let's start thinking about the workplace. So in the Toronto Star last month, there was an article that came out. It was about how gender-neutral personal pronouns go back centuries. And they consulted dictionaries, and it was quite a factual article. But at the end, there was this little tidbit by an LGBTQ watchdog organization head, and this is what he says. We need to start normalizing asking for pronouns, not just for non-binary trans people, but in daily life. Why not include your pronouns in your signature of your email? Another thing we can do is include pronouns when we're introducing people. And their example is, my name is Shane. I use he, him pronouns. What about you? Okay. And also recently, the NDP Policy Convention, they had name tags. It had a spot for your name, and then it had a spot for your pronoun. And in a news article I found from Arizona, actually, it was profiling this young trans individual who had they, them pronouns. It was profiling that person and their family. And the news article says, each time the family throws a party at their home, name tags are given to each child so that they can explore whatever pronouns they may feel fit them that week. So it's not even about your pronoun forever, it's about how you feel that week. So again, I emphasize that workplace issues are kind of where I'm interested in here, because imagine your workplace issues a memo that says all employees must put their pronouns at the bottom of your email. So, you as an individual are required to do this even though you may not agree with the gender ideology, right? Or at workplace functions and events, or like a networking event, you have to put your pronoun on a name tag. And in Canadian workplace culture, you have to be a team player, you have to be cooperative, you have to show you can work well with others and take direction well. So if you come out as sorry, I don't really want to give into all this pronoun stuff, suddenly you've got a target on your back because you've become some sort of black sheep, and now management is going to be watching you, and who knows, you might not get a promotion or something, right? Just because you don't want to ideologically conform to something that you're not really confident in the direction it's going, right? So I completely kind of understand the argument that in the grand scheme of things, is it really a big deal if we have to start introducing ourselves with pronouns or wearing name tags with pronouns? Just this morning, I was reading the news and it came to my attention that there's this man in BC who has a flesh-eating disease. And he had to get a chunk of his shoulder taken out, and it infected his bloodstream, and this was totally random. And so I started thinking about a mass outbreak of a flesh-eating disease, and no one can go to the hospital anymore because there's flesh-eating disease stuff there. And then I thought, well, tonight I have to talk about pronouns, and in comparison to a flesh-eating disease, it seems like such a small issue, right? But I still thought, I need to get the message out that our culture still matters, the direction that this country is going, it still matters. And so, we do need to speak out about these things. Because when you let other people tell you you have to introduce yourself with your pronouns or something like that, you're letting other people own you, and you're letting them control your speech and your behavior. And so, yes, it starts with pronouns, but really it's just an exercise in conformity. that could be the end, but I have like a fun fact. Maybe I'll end on a fun fact. Maybe some of you caught this 2 years ago. The Alberta's Teacher Association says that instead of addressing the class by boys and girls, so teachers, don't say boys and girls, call them comrades. Fun. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I just realized after Lindsay's talk that I am never going to get a job for the rest of my life because I will never use my pronouns and I will not use other people's non-binary gender fluid either, so I'm kind of screwed. Okay, I want to start with you, Jared. I get it when you were saying, and I agree with you, that we've put a social constructionist view into law now. But my question is, and the question of so many people, is how did we get to this point? Aren't lawyers supposed to be intelligent people? Shouldn't they be objecting to this legislation, now this law?
There's a lot of assumptions in that question. There are more than a few lawyers in this room, some from both sides of the aisle, so to speak, in the sense that I know there are some who are on the government benches and some of us who like to think we're opposed to government forces. But I can tell you one thing, just like in general society, I think Barbara had a quote that she read out, they're together and we're on our own. Free thinkers are individuals at heart. We don't buy into collectivist ideology. And so when you get a group of activists who are moving together with a concerted outcome in mind, we're asleep at the switch. But thankfully, people are beginning to speak up. And it's events like this. Obviously, you have to give a ton of credit to someone like Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
There are canaries in the coal mine, and I think Jordan was that. He had the law right. He nailed it from the beginning. He's not a lawyer, but he figured it out. He had some help, but he nailed it. And what we need are canaries in the coal mine. And I mean, the law schools are no different than anywhere else. There is a level of indoctrination into progressive politics that's going on in society and in universities, and the law schools aren't immune from it.
Here's a follow-up, and it's a very serious question, although it may sound silly. Can parents sue school boards or the government for teaching their children an anti-science perspective?
No. In fact, I think there was a recent court challenge at the Divisional Court in Toronto where a parent in Hamilton had sought notification when the school was going to be teaching subjects that parent wasn't. Well, no, they were subjects that the parents said were inconsistent with the religion in the household. And the school board said, we'll see. We'll see if we notify you. And in fact, that parent lost at the divisional court. That's the last I heard of it. So the answer is no. You cannot sue a school board if you enroll your children into the public school system, and it's in fact in the independent school systems as well. Your children, there is no guarantee that you'll even be notified when they do approach subject matters that you might disagree with on a deep conscious or religious level.
That's discouraging. Okay, the next question is for the whole panel, but I'm going to start with you, Barbara. So we're going to all these extremes in our educational, political, cultural, social institutions to accommodate maybe 0.5% or 1% of the population. And women are being asked, and you see this in Australia, and I was reading this in UK, so now conversations such as talking about menstruation, childbirth, nursing babies, even saying maternity ward for women is offensive. Apparently you have to say people on maternity ward. And so is this not an attack against women and our personhood?
Yes, I believe it is. I think it is identity theft. This is the imposition of a word. Well, what I think is interesting is that women now are supposed to identify themselves as cis women.
Yep.
Like, you don't even get the advantage of having the default word applied to you. So you're supposed to say, I am a cis woman, which I will not do. I am a woman.
Yep.
But you're not allowed to say they are trans women. You have to call them women. They don't want to be called trans women, the activists. You must call them a woman, and you can't talk about things like, that childbirth and all that stuff as being irrelevant to them. They are engaged in magical thinking. And magical thinking, they say, it's like in the Soviet Union, George Orwell's 1984, where Big Brother insisted that 2 and 2 equals 5.
Yep.
They want to force us to say 2 and 2 equals 5 because there is a magical belief that if enough people say it and pretend to believe it, then it will be true. That it will be true that they are actually women, not men identifying as women. So they are, this small cadre of, and I don't know how it was the trans activists that turned out to be the sort of Marxist clones who actually made the successful revolution. And it is a revolution, and it has been successful because it is now systemically imposed on every institution, including scientists, doctors, endocrinological associations. The endocrinologists are the front lines of the science debate. They have now been infiltrated and corrupted. Their associations are now corrupted, so that trans activists can legitimately say, but the scientists are on our side. So in fact, the revolution has been won, and it was allowed to be won by people of good faith who thought that they were ushering in an era of social justice. And they decided we prefer social justice to justice, and this is the result.
Sarina, I jump in on this one. It always struck me as unusual that when they attempt to redefine the linguistic territory, they remove words, they don't add words. And so the example is there's a piece of legislation in Ontario recently introduced called the All Families Are Equal Act. And that act had the effect of removing the words mother and father from all legislation in Ontario. There are now only parents and birth parents. When I see things like that, I wonder, why are we tearing down? Why aren't we adding in? So for example, why don't we add the terms parent and birth parent to those that feel that more adequately describes what they are? Why do we remove things like mother and father? And there was another example out in BC. One of the school boards said that they were going to do away with Mother and Father's Day. Well, rather than do away with those things, why not add in the new group, the new class, the new terminology? And that always makes me suspicious, because it makes me think that they really are about tearing down, about removing, not about building up and creating inclusivity.
It reminds me of what Dr. Jordan Peterson said, and I think his name is going to come up a lot tonight, because he is single-handedly the person that brought this to national and international awareness, this whole issue.
I was going to add, I think it's also a complete waste of time and resources. So we look at something I've written before about how, say, the subway system in New York City and London, instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, they say passengers, or they use gender-neutral language. And if we look within neuroscience, where literally researchers are going and they're looking at every single part of the brain that is sexually dimorphic, so parts of the brain that have been shown to be different between men and women, and they're somehow magically showing that they aren't different. But even still, if all the studies show that every single part of the brain is identical between the sexes, that's not going to stop sexism.
So Lindsay, if I said I identify as Japanese, I am Japanese. If you do not call me Japanese, I would see that as bigoted, because that is the ethnicity I identify. It sounds crazy and absurd, but do you see, if we could project forward a bit, that how will we stop people from identifying with different cultures, different races, ethnicities?
I don't know about that part. I mean, I watched Rachel Dolezal's movie on Netflix, and I actually quite liked it, and I kind of liked her. But in terms of just like the craziness, my little sister is 10 years old, and she's doing like a summer math camp for middle school. And I barely believed her on this, but pronouns are banned in her class this summer. You need to use the person's name. They're given a name, the teacher said, and you have to use it because if you use a gender pronoun, they might feel really insecure. And this happened the next class. My sister overheard someone say she in reference to someone else, and the teacher said, pronouns, no.
Well, the reason I asked that is because, Barbara, you wrote, I don't know if it was an email or you sent out a tweet about the University of Delaware sent out this, form to students or an email saying that they could choose their own culture.
Well, it was a form that you filled out for application, part of your application to going into grade 1. Grade 1. This was 6-year-olds.
Yep.
And they wanted to know in advance, did you identify as male, female, whatever, and what race did you identify as? So I think what they wanted, they probably had in mind kids that were biracial and which one did they want to identify with. But in fact, the language is there, and it's fair enough for somebody to say, I identify as black, or native, or whatever. And I asked trans activists, they hate it when you ask them, so what about Rachel Dolezal? Is she really black? Is she black? And if not, why not? I mean, skin tone is immutable, genitals are immutable, like sex is immutable. So is your skin color define your race, or is race a social construct?
Yeah.
And that's a tough one for them to answer.
Yeah. Doctor, so what I was saying to Jared earlier is about so few lawyers speaking up. I know Jared does, and Bruce Party, and there's a couple of others. The same thing could be said about neuroscientists and people who study human anatomy and biology, evolutionary biologists. What is your sense of why there is so much fear and silence on speaking out about what is obviously 100% scientifically true?
I think the people promoting this agenda think that they are genuinely doing something helpful. I think they feel that they're helping to advance us in some way. But in terms of the science, I think part of it is that when you are untenured, it's scary. But nowadays, even as a tenured academic, tenure doesn't protect you from losing your job if people get upset, or if you get mobbed on social media, or if enough people complain to your department. So I think part of it is that, from the conversations I've had, some academics think, okay, I'll wait till I get tenure, and then I'll start saying what I really think. But then by the time that happens, I mean, at this point, it's like 40 years later, you're so used to keeping your mouth shut that it's almost that you've forgotten how to.
I know people get offended with this, but I don't care, and I'm going to ask it anyways. Have we normalized a mental health condition in our society?
When you say that, are you referring to gender?
I'm referring to people who say they're non-binary, they're gender fluid, because I'm baffled. I do not know how a person can be non-binary or gender fluid. I just don't get that. Certainly, if somebody who was anorexic was saying things about like, no, this is the right weight, I feel okay, there's treatments, there's programs. No doctor would validate that. Maybe they will in the future, but they don't. But why are so many people willing to validate what doesn't exist? Because according to my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't be gender fluid and you can't be non-binary.
I think part of it, for the younger kids, I think it's just part of development and, trying out different ideas of who you are. And that way I don't think it's as pathological, but I do think on some level, society is rewarding people who have, especially with something like a personality disorder, where these individuals have to be special and they always have to be the center of attention. And so they're basically being rewarded now. And the way that would come out before might be in some other form, but now it's gender because that's the hot new thing.
Mm-hmm. So Jared, one of the things when I was looking at all the feedback that people were giving me about tonight's event, and there was a lot of sort of just general legal questions that apply to sort of day-to-day reality. So for example, a man walks into, here in Toronto in a community center, man walks into the change room, women's locker room, begins to undress or shower, women freak out, scream, go to the front, tell the staff come in, remove him, and he says, yeah, but I'm identifying as a woman, that's what I feel, even though he has his male genitalia. And could those staff people who now removed him be dragged before the Human Rights Tribunal?
Oh, absolutely, and it's happening, and has happened in Toronto. There was a situation with a spa in Toronto that had a very similar situation to that, and absolutely, it can ground a tribunal complaint. The tribunal, in looking at it, and I've seen some of the cases, they find themselves contorting in arriving at a decision that would prevent the most absurd application of the law. The law allows for that person to identify in that way at that moment, at any time, regardless of outward appearance, regardless of anything. There's no objective measure of it. But what I've seen at the tribunal is they'll use words like, is this really this person's lived identity? Well, that's not a legal term. That's just a tribunal member trying to figure out a way to deal with a situation that has got inherent ambiguity in it. So absolutely, that situation could happen. It would ground a complaint, and that person, that complainant, would have a valid claim under C-16 under the provincial law as well.
Okay, so then say I was that staff person who took the person out. I end up at the tribunal. They tell me, okay, we're fining you, or this is the punitive measure. I say, well, no, I refuse to go along with this delusional thinking. Am I going to jail?
This is a good question. So that was another controversial issue that came out of Jordan Peterson talking. He was told by several important people, in air quotes, you don't get to go to jail. You do get to go to jail. People have gone to jail in Canada for breaching human rights tribunal orders on more than one occasion. It is a simple civil contempt of court process. If you don't pay the fine, they'll garnish your wages, they'll make your life a financial misery, they'll bankrupt you. But the fines aren't really the problem with the tribunal. What you're really facing when you get brought before the tribunal, first of all, is the procedure. The procedure itself will bankrupt you if you're just a normal person on the street. And there is no ability to recover your legal fees in the event that you're successful at the end of the day. But the other issue with the tribunal is they can give what are called non-monetary orders. And they do this all the time. Public interest remedies is what they call them. Things like undergoing sensitivity training. I mentioned the situation with the client of mine who had fled communism in Laos and was told that they needed to undergo a human rights training seminar. If you don't do those things, then you're in contempt of court, and the orders of the tribunal are the same as the order of a court. If you continue to dig in your heels and not fall into compliance with that order, prison is the outcome. The only way in which the courts have to enforce non-monetary remedies is the threat of jail. And it happens, and it's happened more than once. I've had to regularly put out information to show people that this does happen. And when Dr. Peterson said, I'm not going to use those words, if he stuck on that position and public interest remedies were introduced into a tribunal situation, he'd be a political prisoner at some point.
Wow, that's disturbing. So Barbara, this brings me to this question about journalism and journalist responsibility. Should not we be hearing about this in every front page? Should not journalists be on the front line of questioning how we would allow men with male genitalia who are identifying as women into spaces that girls, teenagers, women are using, and the danger and threat that poses to them? Which is not to say I'm suggesting that people who are transgendered like that are necessarily violent, but there is a question here about female space, about, just feeling like I wouldn't feel comfortable if there was a man that walked in. So why of course you talk about it, but I don't hear journalists discussing this.
There's not a great deal of discussion about it, and there's not a great deal of reportage on events like Morgane Ogre, this BC, the deputy head of the BC...
Vice president of the BC NDP party.
the NDP party, and who seems to spend most of her time, tracking down people that she can drag to the Human Rights Tribunal. And the most famous case is that she there was a woman at a protest, a feminist at a protest, holding up a sign saying trans women are biological males or they're not, whatever. Mm-hmm. And Morgane Ogre put on her Facebook or Twitter, there was a picture of her holding up, does anybody know who this woman is? I want her name. I want to take her to the Human Rights Tribunal for hate speech. Now, this is an NDP, this is a politician who actually has lost the distinction between complying with a law, like say calling Morgane Ogre she, you know, and the right to say this is a bad law, or this is not my belief, or I don't believe that trans women are real women. We still have that right, I think, in conversation or to hold up a sign. But she says, no, it's the law. You must believe it. It's not enough. You are not allowed to say or to express that belief. And this is a politician who would love to. Oh, and you're not allowed to say it's an affliction. When I said when I said that gender dysphoria was an affliction, she was ready to, you know, she thought that was hate speech. And I'm like, well, are you going to take the DSM-5 to the Human Rights Tribunal? I mean, is that next? You know, like, how many people can you take to the Human Rights Tribunal for expressing, yeah, this is suffering. Gender dysphoria is suffering. But there's this no, don't say it. And somebody on Twitter said, you can't say that anymore, that it's an affliction. You can't say that anymore. And I'm like, what are you, the head of the language? Like, police? I mean, what do you mean I can't say it? Of course I can say it. It's like, I gave her the example. I said, I think diabetes is an affliction. Mm-hmm. Is it? Is that hate speech? Do I hate diabetics? You know, diabetics and trans people have to be on medication for their entire lifetimes. Isn't that an affliction if you have to be on medication to maintain your sense of well-being, literal or mental? Anyways, these are just anecdotes, but they give you, they tell you what's in the heads of politicians now, that or trans activists is this yearning to force you to say that 2 and 2 are 5. Yes. They want to hear you say it and say it out loud, and they would do it if they could. They would force you to do it. It's really creepy.
Yeah, Morgane sent me tweets telling me I was stupid and dumb and I should read a science book. So I've been getting tweets from her.
Well, they do that. You know, it gets down to ad hominems, and you're a fascist, and you're yeah.
Doctor, so when we talk about children and cognitive development and maturity and their understanding about sex and sexuality, I go back to my original thought as someone who's been a child advocate for over 22 years. I see this as state-sanctioned child abuse. For example, my friend, I used to be a counselor at Children's Aid, but my friend is still there, and she told me last month, a 13-year-old girl who, you know, for 3 or 4 weeks began to say she was a boy and she feels like a boy and started dressing like a boy. And her parents, devout Christians, said, no, honey, this is, you know, you're not a boy, you're a girl. 13. She has been removed from this home, apprehended by Children's Aid, by Catholic Children's Aid Society. She is in a foster home now, and she is being taken to the trans clinic and is being administered puberty blockers. So again, my question is this not state-sanctioned child abuse? Because I know when parents would leave their kids unsupervised, which is, you know, in the house with the door locked, which is way less serious, we would intervene. So my question again is, how are we as a society, and what does this say about us that we are allowing this to move forward?
Was this under Bill 89? So
yes, it was.
So, I mean, for anyone who might be watching this later, I mean, it shows you that this is actually happening. People were saying this law was coming in, and no. I mean, every single left-wing outlet pretty much was saying the far right is so wrong when they say that the state's going to come in and take your child. That's not going to happen, but it's actually happening. I guess I understand. I mean, I try to be sympathetic to the other side and see previously medical gatekeeping was difficult for trans people, and they weren't able to get the support and help that they need. But now it's gone so far in the opposite direction that it's just as harmful. And in the case of children, I've written previously about the topic of desistance, which is extremely controversial because all research studies on this topic show that the majority of gender dysphoric children outgrow their dysphoria. They grow up to be gay adults. They're not transgender in adulthood. And so even if she, I mean, this could be a fleeting thing. It could be that she's gay. She'll be a gay adult. Or, I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
And I can't even imagine the trauma being separated from your mom, dad, and your 4 brothers and sisters, put in a foster home, and now she's being taken to a trans clinic and administered these potent types of medication. It defies reason.
Off-label use as well, and the thing is, once you start cross-sex hormones, sterilization comes with that. And I don't know that parents know that. The sense I get is that a lot of parents just sign the consent form because they think that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Lindsay, you're around a lot of young people in a university setting, and young people are known to be activists and very politically vocal. Have you first of all received support about your sort of struggles that you've been having with Laurier? And do you see any type of movement among young people challenging the absurdity of 72 pronouns now on Facebook, challenging the absurdity of being gender fluid or non-binary, or do you see more of a conformity culture?
I definitely see more conformity, but I have been supported, and even trans people support me too, because they don't think it's like either you can have free speech or you can have like human rights, right? Obviously, they go together. But in terms of, sometimes I think back to my class in November and how, there was 25 students in each of those classes that I taught. So that day, that means 75 students were taught by me the day that I showed the Peterson video, because I showed it in all of the classes. Yep. And I think, they're watching how all this has played out, probably quite carefully because they were in the room. And now they know how things are going to turn out. And these are first-year students. And so I wonder if they think, wow, you can't go against anything or you'll end up vilified. And so they won't. And that's just that class, right? I'm sure things happen all the time in other classes.
Jared, do you think there will be a legal pushback? Do you think if enough people, lawyers, academics got together, they can take this? I don't know the facts, but can this go to the Supreme Court of Canada?
Oh, absolutely. I've indicated to you that nobody has taken the compelled speech argument head on any of these pieces of legislation, but it's fully available to those who are inclined to do so. Typically speaking, though, they have to come after you for you to enunciate that argument. In other words, you unfortunately would have to await the grinder coming after you, be it a tribunal exercise or something like that, and then you would raise the charter issue that it's a compelled speech unconstitutional piece of legislation. But nobody's done that, and that also presumes that somebody's got the resources, the time, the effort, and the legal team to be able to do that.
There was that very interesting case of the couple, the foster parents of the 2 little girls, and they are religious Christians, and
Yes.
the social worker was insisting that they tell the little girls that the Easter Bunny was real.
Yep.
And they refused to comply because that was their principles, their Christian principles. They took the children away. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms took up their case, and they won, but they didn't get the children back. And those children were loved. They were in a fabulous, wonderful home. These were fine, upstanding parents. Those children were, I'm sure, they'd been in their home for 2 or 3 years and were getting loving, wonderful care, were happy children, and I dare say they're now traumatized for life. So there's compelled speech that ended with a charter victory, you might say, but it was a Pyrrhic victory because they lost the children. So,
and those are rare victories. When I look at what's going on, I see the legislative environment. You can sit and play whack-a-mole with all these different incidences of authoritarianism and compelled speech and free speech issues. But it seems to me that the solution is one at a political and legislative level. In the same way in which these measures are brought forward, that's how you push back against it. And I mean, that frankly, that's the best way to do it. It gives you the most certainty of outcome.
But history has shown that sometimes the legislatures fail, as we can see in, like, let's look at the U.S. Change is brought when the masses protest, when the masses came out and said, no, this is this.
But then there's other examples where Section 13, the hate speech provision of the former hate speech provision in the Canadian Human Rights Act, Ezra Levant, Mark Stein successfully essentially knocked that section out when they showed how it was being abused and things like that. And that didn't require a mobilization of an army. In fact, I don't think a lot of people even knew that had happened. Once again, get on YouTube, look up the testimony of Mr. Stein and Mr. Levant, regardless of what you might think of either one of them. They did yeoman service in getting rid of what was a very draconian law from our human rights system.
Okay, so any one of you can take this question, and if nobody volunteers, I'll choose somebody. In all that I've been reading lately leading up to tonight, I really can't find much prior to Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner, when he said he was a woman. So correct me if I'm wrong, would we even be having this conversation sitting here? Because this entire issue blew up with Caitlyn Jenner when the entire media, Vogue magazines, covers, every journalist you could think
Woman
of.
of the Year in 2015 for Glamour magazine, which tells you what the media, how complicit, how happy the media is to be complicit with this.
Yeah, this is for anyone who wants it. Is that your sense? This is my sense, that this started with Caitlyn Jenner, and it blew up, and it's impacting us in Canada, in other places as well.
It was becoming a thing anyways, and this kind of galvanized. It was the sort of presenting victory in that sense, to see somebody so famous, and particularly since he had been a star athlete and so gorgeous as a man and powerful as a man, and by the way had taken a lot of drugs as an athlete, and there is a lot of speculation amongst people who follow athletes that have become trans, have come out trans later, and I really hope some research is done on this, because I think there's good reason to think that when you take all those hormonal uppers and whatever they do, the athletes, that this may have contributed to, because it was adult onset. So anyways, but that's a sidebar. Yeah, it was a galvanizing incident. I'm
conscious of the time, so maybe we can get a couple of more questions in here.
Did we do the Twitter thing? Did it happen?
Yeah, so maybe Noem, if he can hear me, he can kind of let me know where we're at with that. Oh.
Thank you.
Looks like there's a lot.
Okay, this seems interesting. Here's a question. And Lindsay, maybe you want to take this one. It says, since the Monk debate, Jordan Peterson has been asking the question, when has the left gone too far? And the answer seems to include equality doctrine. What's your sense? First of all, has the left gone too far?
I almost think that it's just political correctness in general. There are a lot of leftists who are friendly to this, but they kind of have to hide.
Yep.
And what else did it say?
It said basically that
when did the left
like
go?
this famous Monk debate that Dr. Peterson had, and one of the main questions he was asking, which I don't think was ever answered, like now we have like radical leftists dictating these agendas, and when has the left gone too far, and why aren't the moderate leftists calling out the radical leftists?
Yeah, they absolutely should. But I feel like I'm too young to answer that question, because my whole school
I know
has
what he
been
meant.
from that
I know what
perspective.
Jordan Peterson meant. Jordan Peterson meant, he said, when you ask right-wingers, when does the right go too far, there's an easy answer, Auschwitz. He says, but when you ask a left-winger, when does the left go too far, they don't answer Stalin. They don't answer the gulags. They don't answer Cambodia. They don't answer any of those things, because there's always a reason why it was never communism's fault. It was just, that was like, it wasn't real communism, so they'll never admit, they will not they will not apologize for past mistakes on the left, whereas the right is constantly denying. They know the dangers of the far right, and they absolutely put them down, but leftists don't.
Okay. So, question for Jared. Please talk about where average people can go for affordable legal defense against the Ontario
I'll plead the
Human Rights
fifth.
Commission if they are accused of harassment under this law.
Affordable, you say?
Affordable, yes.
There are lawyers at all price points. Thankfully, the legal industry is private enterprise dominated. You will find a lawyer at all levels of the price point. Look around on the internet. But there is, if you're a complainant to the tribunal, you get free legal advice. So there is a legal services office connected to the tribunal that will give the complainants free legal representation. If you are on the receiving end of the tribunal, however, I think you might be on your own.
Okay, doctor, so maybe you can take this one. So this person is concerned about sending their children to school and wants to know, is it better for children to be homeschooled so that they won't be taught this false science narrative?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this since the decision happened last week with the sex ed being scrapped, and now it seems like the gender stuff is going to be put back in, though I'm not sure if it's going to be the same until they redo it fully. But I think ultimately, so where I stand with sex ed, I do think comprehensive sex ed is a good thing. So this is sex education that teaches kids not just about pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections, contraception, gives them the information that they need to make good decisions around sex. And research has shown that it actually delays when kids start having sex, and they are more likely to use protection when they do. So I think even if we had the best possible sex ed curriculum, I still think just with how politics are, you can't please everyone. So I think ultimately the parents should play a role in the home. I don't think homeschooling necessarily needs to be the solution. I understand it's probably very uncomfortable to talk to your kids about sex, but studies have also shown that really is good for them in that if kids feel they can talk about it with their parents openly and ask questions, they will make better decisions about their sexual health. So I'm very much about leaving the state out of this stuff.
Okay. We'll do a couple of more. Lindsay, why have so few tenured professors spoken out publicly in support of you, specifically and more generally against various campus trends that are discussed today? So I guess basically the gist of the question is, why the silence from tenured professors? There's thousands of them across the country, but...
Yeah, I mean, the academy is overwhelmingly left in general, though. So I think those would be the people who wouldn't sympathize with me anyway, and maybe didn't agree with what I did in the first place. Mm-hmm. And that's just, I think it's wrong, but that's just the way it is now. So I've given up on academia. I don't really have a positive answer.
Okay. Okay, second last question. Jared, if I identify as transracial, can I seek government benefits if I choose to identify as an Indigenous individual?
So if you had told me in law school 16 years ago that I'd be getting a question like this on the stage at the Canadian Christian College, I would have said you're crazy. I will defer on answering it. That obviously it's not connected to what we're talking about in terms of gender, but...
But do you foresee a time, because I'm really concerned about this, that people will begin to identify as transracial? We already have transableism, or that people will identify as different cultures. Like Barbara talked about the University of Delaware. They're allowing people to tick boxes that what culture they want to be identified with. So I see the problem in this question. But is that a reality we could be facing in 10 years?
Well, I mean, it's showing the absurdity of C-16. When you introduce an entirely subjective sense of identity into human rights protection, then you're essentially, that you have no argument against the logic that we've been talking about here. Self-identification is now how people, I mean, within the Law Society, I can speak to, they send out a demographic survey and people self-identify on those. And then they are taking positive and they are taking authoritarian steps when they receive that data. So, I mean, yeah, it sounds absurd, but when you've got a social constructionist theory of gender put into law that's based on self-identification, then you know, where do we stop?
Yeah. And this last question is for Barbara and Dr. So. Are we going to see a lot of people resign from journalism and the medical profession due to the current restrictions and guidelines? So why don't we start with you, Barbara, and then we'll go to Dr. So.
So are we going to see a decline?
Yeah, are we going to see, well, it doesn't say decline. Are we going to see a lot of people resign from the journalism and medical profession because of the current restrictions and guidelines, and they just can't go along with this?
I don't know about medical, and I don't think a lot of journalists will resign, because I think most journalists are already quite okay with the status quo. And if you want to get into journalism and you have views like mine, you're going to have a very tough time. I just got in when the getting was good. So if you have views like mine, you might as well start your own blog and hope that you get picked up by Breitbart or something like that. You know, I think most journalists go with the flow. First of all, they come out of journalism school, which is, you know, part of the same, it's the same systemic, they believe in it. They believe in social justice. They believe in all this stuff. So they have no problem with it.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
And so the same question is for you, Dr. So. Do you see a lot of medical professionals resigning due to the current restrictions, guidelines, and for ethical reasons?
I have actually had some colleagues tell me that they won't. So with regards to treating kids with gender dysphoria, we saw what happened to Kenneth Zucker here in Toronto. His clinic was shut down 3 years ago because he was accused of practicing conversion therapy. What he was doing was not conversion therapy. He was trying to understand, for kids who are having issues with their gender, what is the underlying reason, and if a child reached puberty, and he's published studies on this showing if a child reaches puberty and they still feel that way, he would advocate for them undergoing blockers and potentially cross-sex hormones if he thought that would be beneficial. So after that happened, I mean, it set a complete chill across the field, and now clinicians who are not on board with this ideology will, from what I've been told, refuse to see children or refuse to see gender dysphoric patients across the board because they don't feel ethical about what they have to do, which is basically affirm no matter what now.
Thank you all very much. And I'm wondering if one of the volunteers could maybe get the podium up on stage so we can just make concluding remarks. Somebody? Anybody? Okay, maybe not. I'll just do it from here. Thank you so much. Thank you to the entire audience for being here tonight and being a part of this very important discussion. Like I said in my introduction, I hope that when you leave here, you take this conversation with you, have this conversation with friends, family, and of course your children, because I think it's very important for us to, as Dr. So talked about, like, we're using children as pawns here, so it's very important to have these conversations. I am very grateful to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. Again, they are Jared Brown, litigator in Toronto, Dr. Debra So, neuroscientist and author, Lindsay Shepherd, president, Laurier University Center for Open Inquiry, and the amazing Barbara Kay, journalist and author. A special thank you to Barbara. She flew in from Montreal for this talk. Please bear with me. I'd like to do a few thank yous. I'd like to first thank PAVE, Parents as First Educators, particularly Tanya Granick-Allen. I've gotten to know Tanya over the last few months, and I consider her a friend, and I can tell you she's a truly dignified and courageous lady who is standing up for Ontarians, for families who do not have a voice in the very radical and extreme over-sexualized sex ed curriculum. And she has been their voice, even though the media has vilified her. She's an absolutely amazing person. Tanya. Thank you very much to Students for Free Speech at York U, particularly Noam Saboni and Priyank Desa, for helping me in my panic moments to figure out all the technical aspects, volunteering, and helping me put this event together. Thank you to Dr. Roy, a respected endocrinologist who flew in from Montreal to be here, and he's been very generous in his contribution to ensure that this event could be possible. Thank you, Dr. Roy, and I'm glad you could join us. There's a special thank you to Pastor Paul Dirks in New Westminster, British Columbia, who's fighting the same fight that we're all fighting on this stage, and he's been very supportive to me from day one. And a very special thanks to my mentor, Dr. Jordan Peterson, really a man who needs no introduction, clinical psychologist, best-selling author, professor, University of Toronto, a man who single-handedly brought this issue to national and international consciousness, dialogue, and awareness. And he has played a really key part in the dialogue that is taking place tonight. And I know I speak for all the panelists when I say we are all very grateful for the work he is doing. Lastly, I can't do this work alone, and thankfully the people I mentioned, when it became overwhelming, they stepped in to help. There's a huge emotional, psychological, and physical cost to this that is quite taxing. The amount of hate, vitriol, nasty emails I've received is quite alarming. To be called a Nazi and even things that aren't even relevant, like Islamophobe, we're not talking about Islam, and a bigot and all this, to have this conversation in a democracy, it's not the insults that bother me so much, it's that in a democracy, we're shutting down debate. We're shutting down voices that we don't like what they're saying and we don't agree with. So silence is not an option for all of us because I think our fundamental rights are at stake. And I hope you all join me in considering helping out in future projects if possible. There is flyers for you to take a look at, and I hope you will read. I have a lot of plans to do future events, so please stay tuned for that if Facebook doesn't kick me off again and delete my webpage, which is always a possibility. And I want to thank my family, and I really want to thank my cousin Bobby and sister-in-law Harjeet, who are here, who insisted I go forward with this discussion because it was so important to me, and I'd worked so hard for it. So in the moments when I was in despair thinking, maybe I just can't do this, and it's just too much. Bobby and Harjeet, love you both. Thank you all. Have a very wonderful night. Thanks for being here.